Find your path with the knowledge of others and become an illuminator for those who struggle. Guide their way just by being true and being in alignment because it comes naturally to you. On self-discovery wisdom, we share to find inspiration with lessons for millions. We hope you listen.
Good afternoon and good evening, everybody. Welcome back to another edition of Sara's View of Life right here at selfdiscoverywisdom.com. I'm going to be doing a series. I had a conversation with someone the other day about me being 71 and saying that 71 just feels like a number, but when you look back and realize that's 7 decades of living, I realized that there was a lot packed in each of those decades, and it was suggested, why don't I do a show on it? So I'm actually going to do 7 shows. I'm going to take each decade and address those first 10 years, then the next 10, and so on and so on. And this is the first 10 years. So I was born October 6, 1954, just past midnight. My mother had gone into labor the Wednesday before, Wednesday night, saying, thank God she's not going to be a Wednesday's child because Wednesday's child is full of woe. And my mum was in labor until the following Wednesday, where I waited until midnight at Wednesday to be born. To say I've had some woe in my life? Yeah, yep, I have. But can we blame a Wednesday for it? Who knows? So apparently I was a very healthy baby. Though my mum said that when I was born, I looked battered and blue. She'd been in labor with me for a long time, and it was getting rather desperate, kind of her life was at risk. And in the morning, they were going to do an operation. And I was already in the birth canal, so it would have been very tricky. And a couple of midwives just got in there and apparently pushed me out. And I looked battered and blue and wrinkled and God knows what else. And my mother apparently looked at me and said, all that for that. I made it a point when I had my children to hold them and tell them how beautiful they were, welcome to the world, and what a beautiful life was ahead of them, because I wanted them to have positive words to be welcomed into the world with. But, my mum had gone through a lot in that week, and I suppose she expected a beautiful bouncing baby. I did, however, in the first 2 years of my life, become this happy, plump little girl. And of course, in those days, if you were a plump baby, that meant you were a healthy baby. But at the age of 2, the Asian flu hit England, and it hit England hard. Both my mother and father became ill with it, and so did I. Desperately ill. And that ignited a lifelong journey with asthma and eczema. Apparently, my eczema looked like pennies in those days were big, hot things like this, big round things. And my mum said that it looked like these red hot pennies had been dropped all over my body. And it was like oozing and boils, etc. Not very pleasant. And the thing about it is, I remember being in a bath. I don't know what age I was, because I got this quite a lot when I was young and then later in my teens. Water, it felt like acid on it. And so that was the eczema. And the eczema continued with me for many, many years. But we're talking about the first 10. I would get it in my fingers, so I'd burned my fingers and they would crack. So you would always see pictures of me with my fingers bandaged up. And I'd get it in the crevices of my arm and behind my knees. And yeah, it wasn't fun, but it was what it was. And the asthma, well, that was a little more dangerous. Back then, they didn't have, asthma pumps and things like this. They had a pill that could calm the lungs down, but it took 15 to 20 minutes to do so. So apparently I would end up in hospital on oxygen. And my mum, at the moment I started with a sneeze or a cough or anything, into bed I went, and I would be there for weeks sometimes. And when she saw an asthma attack coming on, she would tell me a story to calm me down, and sit me up and, head over the hot water and the steam. And by the age of 14, I discovered Ventolin, the asthma pump, which became a lifesaver. But that was at 14. So the first 10 years, or the 8 years, because I got it at 2, I was fighting asthma. People in those days died of asthma. I was a lucky one. I didn't. Most people outgrow it. I was the unlucky one because I didn't. And it stayed with me. And it put a lot of barriers in my way through life. Sports, missing a great deal of school. I wanted to be a dancer. No one would hire me because of my asthma. But that's beyond 10. So school I missed a great deal of. And I remember going to boarding school, which was quite normal back in England for that time period. We went off to boarding school. My brother and sister went off at 6. I went off at just before my 9th birthday. I was later because of my asthma. And I remember kind of like my parents leaving and not really understanding what was going on. And it was kind of quite a shock, kind of to be left there. Um, all these other girls around me. And even though they talked about you going to boarding school, I didn't really know what it meant until I was there. And of course, he would get sick there and into bed and miss school again, etc., etc. And of course, when you have these asthma attacks, you kind of can black out sometimes because you can't breathe. And so definitely had an effect on my brain of lack of oxygen getting there. But I also had learning disabilities, which I would discover much later in life. So learning for me was always very difficult. I'd come back from being ill, back into the classroom. Everybody's so far ahead and I'm so far behind. And I did not learn the conventional way. I learned through conversation. I learned through participation, but I did not learn through books. I literally could look at a book, and my reading only came later in life because I found it hard to read. Later, I discovered dyslexia. But then there was no diagnosis for thing. You were either a smart child or a dumb child, and I was a dumb one. And it was really, really difficult because I kind of couldn't live up to that way of learning. And so I get left behind. So school was a big challenge. I remember the age of 3 going to kind of a preschool and being left at school. And it was the school is still there today, St. Martin's in Grimsby in England, Lincolnshire. And it's still there today, still serving children. And of course, we were always in uniform. So in our little, tunics and our hats and our blazers and the right socks and shoes, there was always a formal attire. And again, it was like me in uncharted area. And I remember one time, it's kind of funny when you look back on it. I went to school and I hadn't put my knickers on. I got everything else on but my knickers. And then I realized I didn't have my knickers on and I just cried. And I wanted my knickers on and I felt so embarrassed. But I'm 3 or 4, you know, like my mum lived about 16 miles away at that time. And of course, no cell phones. She probably went off shopping or met a friend and so couldn't got be hold of. And, school was a long day. We finished at 4 then. But I remember meeting a young girl who was my mum's hairdresser's daughter, and she was 11. So to me, she was all grown up, a big senior. And of course, when I reached 11, that was a different story, right? But I do remember one Christmas, we did a little concert thing for our family. I might have been more 4 to 5 at this point. And we sang Away in a Manger. And the song always moved me, and it still does. But I remember actually being proud that I remembered the words. As I said, I learnt more from participation and repetition than I did from books. And I just remember that so well. The school was lovely, and we had school lunches. And so I remember my age group going off to this one room, and it was round tables and little chairs because we were little people, and we would get a hot lunch. And of course, there's no fussiness in those days. It was eat what's in front of you. And if I was very asthmatic and things, my appetite was not there. I found it very hard to eat. That plump little baby that had been there was not. I was a skinny little girl. Um, and, a healthy appetite when I wasn't ill, and when I was ill, a very unhealthy appetite. And, but I do remember the school lunches. I went to one, two, three schools with school lunches, and they were good. They were really good. I'll talk about the one in boarding school in a moment. And then, of course, it came time for me to go to boarding school. And I remember they looked at a very prestige boarding school, but they decided it was too big for me, and I was too far behind in my education, and I would not excel there. So they picked this wonderful area. It was called Haunton House, and originally a squire had lived there, and he owned the village and the fields around him. And so, of course, now it had been converted into a school. And there were some happy memories there once I got used to being away from family. They had a paddock, and we used to run out in the paddock, and could we get back over the fence before the geese started nipping at our butts or our ankles? And they had areas where we made forts. And one time I fell asleep in the fort, and everybody went back to class, and I was asleep, and they had to go looking for me. There I was, curled up in my fort. Sleep was always a bad thing for me, has always been all my life. And so when we went to bed at 7 o'clock at night, um, very often I could not sleep. I also became a dormitory monitor, which meant that I was in charge of the other kids. This was when I was more 9, 10, 10 of age. And the kids wouldn't go to sleep unless I told them a story. But then I would get into trouble for talking after lights out, and I would have to go downstairs and write out 200 times, I will not talk after lights out. So what I used to do in the day is start writing it and put it in my desk. So that when I went down at night, I could finish it off. And also with my writing, I might start off coherently, but the more and more I write, the more scrawlish it becomes. So you probably won't be able to read the last 50 lines and then go back up to bed. But my sleep had been disrupted. So then it would take me forever to go to sleep. And then we're woken up in the morning, and there we are back in class and everything. And, I had the battle with that. I remember there was a bunch of girls, seniors, I have no idea what their names were. I just remember three girls. And they took me I had a ponytail. They took me by the hair, and they took me out into the garden where they dug a hole, and they were burying me like a weed. And this is because of my asthma and the things that I could not do. The stupid thing is, they buried me like a weed right outside the principal's office. And she looked out the window and found them burying me. So, of course, needless to say, they got into trouble. Part of that, too, was my dad had died. I was 11 years of age. So that belongs into that chapter. I'll leave it at that. But up until the age of 10, my dad had his first heart attack when I was 8. And we thought we were going to lose him then. And my dad changed after that. My dad had been a fighter pilot in the war, squadron leader. He'd be out there protecting the bombers, literally fighting the enemy, going in at night, getting spies out. Just really kind of that hands-on. He was also a racing car driver. He was also a yachtsman. He was a businessman. At the age of 17, in timber import and export. And he was in Germany when the war broke out. He had a German countess girlfriend of 27, or he was 17 or something. And he would go over there to do business because Germany was one of the big exporters of timber and one of the biggest business allies. And of course, that was going to come to an end. And so he had to be got out quickly before, he was discovered. So my dad was a person that always pushed the envelope. But when it came to his life, he was, I don't know. Was he scared? Was he timid? It's really quite extraordinary, actually. My mother and father were 1 week away from sailing to Canada, Vancouver, to extend the timber business over there, which, of course, Canada, big on timber. And it would have been a whole new life for them. My dad would have been working on his own instead of working with his brother, who was 11 years older than him, whom he hated, who was totally incompetent, but counteracted everything he did. Um, I don't know why, but my dad backed out with a week to go. I didn't go. I always believed had he come, because I lived in Vancouver 37 and a half years. Now I'm on Vancouver Island, just over the water a bit. I think he would have had a thriving life, and he and my mother would have excelled here. And I don't know why he didn't have the courage to see it through. This is a man that faced the enemy head on, got many a time, came home with his tail on fire before he was accepted into the Air Force. He was, in the Navy and the ship's going down. He had faced death head on, but why couldn't he face life? This was very interesting. So he had his first heart attack at 40. And I also contribute that a lot to do with the war. The war afterwards was stiff upper lip, man. We won, get on with living. We don't talk about it. And I think that's the biggest detriment to anybody that has faced trauma. And they can't do what they do without facing the trauma. The amount of people that he lost. When he died, there was 2 squadron people left, and both of them died young, and my dad was one. So this whole thing about pushing it under the rug and carrying on, stiff upper lip thing, was just a whole load of codswallop. And they need to talk about it, if not to us civilians, to each other, and to understand what they're going through. They need to release it. If not, it consumes them. And we see this so much with veterans today that are not given that support, that go to addiction or even suicide or violence, and because they're not dealing with the traumas of what they faced at war. And with a certain happy person that wants to send one to war every 5 seconds, we're going to see a lot more trauma there, and we need to be there for them, folks. So please be supportive and realize they're not going to be the same person coming home as they were going. That's just a sidebar. I was just really getting to know my dad. We had a beautiful dog called Candy, Candy Floss, who was a border collie. She used to go to work with my dad. When my dad died, she was 2, and she also became the family dog. And we were out walking one day. I was maybe 10, and we looked up at the moon, and it looked like there were countries on the moon, the way it was all, looking with the crevices and the etc. And it was shining bright in the sky. And I said, "Oh, Dad, you should be with Mom," because thinking it's a romantic moment. And he just said something like, "She's not interested," or something. I can't quite remember, but I know that it kind of took me back. And my dad came out to see me a couple of times at boarding school. I'll cover that in the next decade because they overlap. But we were just getting to know each other. I was getting to a point where I wasn't just a sickly child. I was developing my own personality, and he and I were just getting to know each other. My brother is 5 years older than me. And my sister, who's my stepsister, is 13 years older than me. So when he married my mum, she already had a daughter. And there was a lot of controversy around that too, because um, my father's mother, Daisy, did not want him to marry a divorcee, and made my mother's life hell. And my mum was apparently pregnant with me when my grandmother was dying. And apparently she said, kind of on her deathbed, "I'm so sorry. You've been a good wife to my son, and I'm so sorry the way I've treated you." And then died. But, she put my mum through hell for quite a while. I think I'm a lot like my father, and this is why I'd love to have got to know him better. My mother and I are alike in the sense of the arts, but my brother really picked up more of that. He's a writer. My mother was an actress. I'm a storyteller, but I don't know. I think there's certain aspects of kind of the moving forward and the facing things in life. I don't know. Does that come from my mum? But I don't know. I feel a lot that like my dad is in there. But as he died so young and I was so young, that we really didn't get to know each other on that deep level. But the aftermath, I did. So the first 10 years was me in and out of bed, sick. We did have a seaside home called Sundylands, and we would go there at the weekend and through the summer. My dad had a boat called the Thunderbird, and he and my brother would go out into the water and sailing. And I would play. The house was kind of here, and you crossed the road and you went up the steps and there was a promenade, and there were all these little huts, we called tea room huts. So people who had those huts, they could go make a cup of tea, change, warm up or whatever after swimming in the sea. And then you had all these wonderful steps and breakers that were on the sand and then the sea. And the breakers were there to stop the sand from coming all the way up, just to kind of protect. And we knew a whole load of people there at the weekend. So it was, kind of home away from home. And there I'd be out there in my swimsuit, playing in the sand, playing with other people. And my brother would be out sailing with my dad. And of course, we had the dog on the beach as well. And it was fun times. And then we'd go back to the house at night, which was a 3-bedroom home. And I remember Sundays going to this lovely hotel. Can't remember its name, but it was an old Tudor type looking hotel, and we'd have Sunday lunch and we'd dress up for it because that's what we did back in those days, put on a nice Sunday best. Didn't go to church, but we went to lunch. On Saturdays, we used to go into Sutton because Sutton was the town of Sundyland. And we would line up outside this bakery to get the most delicious donuts. Oh, jam donuts. Absolutely yummy and gorgeous bread. And as British, we love our bread. And they had a pool there, kind of like a wading pool for young people. And I do remember going in and out of that pool as I was growing up because it was kind of safe. It, never became above the knees of a child. And so, you could splash around in there with safety. I do remember that. And then, of course, we had Skegness, which was a little ways up, and that was where all the entertainment was. You had a fixed Ferris wheel and rides and everything else that were there all the time. You had bingo. You had numerous other things going on. There's stacks of restaurants and tea rooms and fish and chip shops and all of that. And so we would occasionally go up there. But our summers and weekends were at their home. We did go away once a year. And I don't know how old I was, but I think I was not yet 10. And we stayed at this beautiful hotel. And, back in those days, the hotels had beautiful wide corridors, lovely big rooms, fabulous dining room, wonderful grounds. There was a pool there, and I was kind of learning to swim. I hadn't quite mastered it yet. And there was an old squash court there that was run down and broken and cracked windows. And my brother was playing hide and seek with me. And I found him, and he went rushing through the window to escape me. And there was glass in the pane of the window, and it slipped his head right open. So, of course, the trauma of that, he had to be rushed to hospital, had to be stitched up, and all the go for that. I can remember that being rather disruptive of our holiday. Um, but yes, I also remember I had a doll's pram, which was a double doll's pram. So, the hood could come up in the middle and you could put 2 dolls in there. And I also had a tricycle. And I would ride this bike and I would have my doll's pram. And in those days, we could go out onto the street and not worry about things. My brother had a red pedal car and he would go everywhere in this. And there was a little pub because we lived out in the countryside at that time. And there was a little pub there, and my brother used to go up there, and apparently the pub person would hear a little voice, lemonade and a packet of chips, please. And he'd look to see where the voice was and look over and see my brother. And what would he be? He's 5 years older than me, so, 7 or 8. And he paddled up to the pub, got his lemonade and chips, put it on my dad's bill, and then ride on home. But I do remember he got a bit jealous of me. And what he did do, he took me up in my pram. And this is one of my first memories. And there was kind of a gravel driveway going down. And he pushed the pram over. And I came tumbling out. Of course, I'm crying. I'm about two something. And it was like he was trying to get rid of me because I think at this point I obviously had a lot of attention, happy little baby. And then I do remember him trying to put me back in. And he was trying to put me in the fallen pram and then lift up the pram, but he was too, he was only 7, he wasn't strong enough. And the prams in those days were big, huge metal things, not like these foldaways put in the back of the car. These were, like vehicles on their own. And I don't know how he got me back in. I think he then tried to put it up and lift me in. And I think somebody eventually must have put me in. But I remember that very, very well. And there was some jealousy there, as there always is between siblings. Then, of course, I got ill. And when I got ill, there was a lot of attention needed on me. And that meant, um, that meant perhaps a little more jealousy. But of course, at the age of 6, he went to boarding school. So he didn't see too much of me. And I'm basically at home on my own for a few years before I could go to boarding school. And I remember my bedroom was big, huge. All the houses were huge with big bedrooms, but it was white. To this day, I can't have a white room. And there weren't many pictures around it. There wasn't much color. And I remember being in that bedroom. Don't forget, with no radio and no TV and no cell phones and no anything else. And I would be there for hours upon hours and days upon days. And they would come in and give me food, and then we'd come in and tell me a story at some point, but I was on my own. And it became something that, well, that's, I think, where I started dimensional traveling. I had to disappear from these white walls. So I used to go off into other worlds. And those other worlds became very real to me. This is when I started seeing entities and started playing with what I call dead people. They would come in and kind of play with me. At, how old was I? 5. We moved to a house more in the city. In those days, these big, huge Victorian houses, they had like 3 enormous bedrooms upstairs in the attic. They had 3 bedrooms on the main floor, and then downstairs was big with a big solarium, and that was just half a house, but it was on the corner. Apparently, the onion guy came around selling onions to the back door and then went round to the front door thinking it was another house. And we were right opposite a park, which was wonderful. And so my dad was much closer to work at that point too. And I do remember my room then having a little more. My mum gave me a lovely dressing table and lovely curtains and things like that. But there was a room off that room, which used to be the nanny's room. And the nanny used to live over there and look after the kid here. But there was also what you called a dumb waiter, which was like an elevator where you could put food on that could go up and down the floors. And I do remember that. But it also used to freak me out sometimes because I would feel these entities that had passed over kind of coming from that room. But eventually I kind of made a friend called Jane who had passed over, and I'd be playing with her, and my mum would come in, oh, who are you playing with your dolls? And da 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 da. I'm Jane. Who's Jane? Well, my sister was called Jane, but this entity was called Jane too. So, they just kind of thought Sara's fanciful, a little imagination, and they kind of didn't get it. At the age of I think it was 9 or 10, we moved to a bungalow. A bungalow is a rancher, a 1 story. And we moved that because that my dad had had his heart attack and we were moving into a place that would be less exertive for him. And they built this bungalow and a place called Healing. And really, really nice one, actually. A lovely living room with big bay windows, a grand piano, mini grand piano. And then you kind of came in through the house, a big, huge open area that would be the dining room, a kind of a galley kitchen, and then 1, 2, 3 bedrooms with 1 bathroom. That's how it was. And then stairs going upstairs to another big room, which was kind of, they made the TV room and the attic. And so it was a very nice house, bungalow. And I do remember that. Um, my dad snored really, really loud. And I remember my mum once, I had twin beds in my room, and I remember my mum once coming in and sleeping in the other bed and still putting a pillow over her head because you could hear my dad through the house. And this was a lot to do with his heart, right? But, you know, he had become a difficult man, and there were a lot of arguments there. But my dad was not an affectionate man. He hadn't been brought up to be affectionate. Um, you know, he was brought up in the era. You know, he was born in 1920. Children should be seen and not heard. Nannies brought him up, right? So uh, I always wanted, you know, hugs and kisses because I'm always an affectionate person. And I would lie there at night with my transistor radio, and I would lie there, and my dad would come in to switch the radio off and switch the light off. And if he thought I was asleep, he would give me a kiss. If he thought I was awake, then he would chastise me. So I pretended to be asleep. So instead of going to sleep, I would wait for him to come in so I could get that kiss. And I do remember him coming home. He was a pipe smoker and filling his pipe and then standing in front of the fire and warming his bum and, you know, having a pipe. And I remember going up and just hugging him. And occasionally he would hold me, but he was not, you know, wasn't that kind of affection. And I think had he had more affection, you know, the marriage wouldn't have been so rocky because my mum needed that kind of affection too, and he just wasn't. Was it the war? Was it the way he was brought up? Was he just not an affectionate person? Who knows? Um, Clearly the affectionate stuff, you know, comes from my mum because I'm very affectionate, as my grandchildren will tell you. So little did we know at that time that having animals like cats aggravated asthma, because at that time they really didn't know what caused asthma. I had the allergy test done. I don't know how old I was, 7 or 8, where kind of stripped me down to just my underpants in a cold room. And what they did is put drops all down my arms and then pricked each of the drop. And all of this stuff would go in and they would look up to see which was aggravated. Dust was number one to my asthma. And of course, cats lick themselves, their dander, and then that turns into dust. So we didn't kind of put it 2 and 2 that, you know, I was allergic to the cats. And then later we had a dog, and I'm better with dogs. I'm okay as long as I wash my hands. But dogs are okay, especially soft fur dogs like a border collie. But um, it just, you know, it was a disease that wasn't really understood. And so, yes, I was allergic to these things, but there wasn't, you know, allergy pills, or there wasn't kind of changing of diet. It just wasn't there. But I do remember in this lovely kitchen in this corner house, the one before we moved to the bungalow, we had somebody that used to come and clean the house, and twice a week she would make bread for us. And I remember her taking the bread out of the oven and would be there with butter on our forks, waiting for it to be cut, patiently kind of waiting for it to cool down enough. And then out comes the knife and be crusting, you know, cutting through the crust, lovely crusty crust, and this fluffy bread inside, and then slapping it with some butter and just eating this wonderful fresh bread straight off. Fabulous, wonderful moments. I remember my sixth birthday. I don't know if I was having a party. I think so, but not at the house. But they said, "What do you want for your birthday?" And I wanted mashed potatoes with white sauce. I loved mashed potatoes and I still did, and I love sauces. My mum was very, very good at sauces. And then I do think we went somewhere to have a party. And in those days, you got dressed up, um, beautiful dresses. I still have one dress that both of my daughters have worn. Unfortunately, I don't have a granddaughter to put it on. Um, so I was hoping to have, it go down to the next generation. Um, and I've still got that gorgeous dress, but we always dressed up for parties, and we wore these kind of hard ballet shoes because they were the party shoes. That's the way it was. This is the 60s, 50s, and 60s. So I do remember going to a party on my sixth birthday, and it was the person's sixth birthday as well. And this person was a very rich farmer. And this kid was getting presents galore, and they got a guitar. And I remember crying because nobody gave me a present. It was my birthday too. And she even got a big house, doll's house to go into. And I was just like, beside myself. I didn't understand. This was her party, but what about my birthday? And that's just one of the lessons a child has to learn. So I didn't learn to read until later. And that, of course, again, we didn't know about the dyslexia. So I had a hard time reading. I had a hard time working out what the letters were. And it was funny, actually, kind of in my teens, I got into Barbara Cartland books, romance novels. And I started reading those and then kind of just didn't stop reading. There's still some things like manuals or how-to books that I can look at, and the words or the lines can move. And I start to yawn because I just can't take it in. And it's just a weird feeling. And sometimes I know if I'm having a bad day because my dyslexia comes up and I start reversing words. And of course, we didn't know about that. It was just like, Sarah's slow to learn. It was put down to the asthma and maybe lack of oxygen to the brain. And my brother was smart. So, at least one of them was. And I remember they did get a reading tutor for me. And it was Dick and Jane books, I think she was reading to me. And I could kind of read them, but I wasn't interested. More interested in conversation, which I always have been. So, my first 10 years was rocky. Up and down with the asthma, up and down with the eczema, in and out of hospital, bandaged up, and have to keep quiet and not realizing the things we were doing around it was what was aggravating it, and feeling very lonely. And, in my book, Sara's Self-Discovery to Soul Living, when I wrote that, I wrote about loneliness in my life. And it's not being around people. The loneliness was just never feeling seen, heard. Never really been seen for who I am, only what other people want from me. And as a fae person, spiritual person, I was able to read a gypsy reading cards from a very young age. And I would have messages come to me, which I would give to my teachers or friends or people, adults. No idea where the messages came from. I just would give them what I've learned. How do you know that? Can you repeat it? No, I can't. No, I can't. It's just out. And I've always been like that still to this day. And I call that the knowingness. It's what people need to know when they need to know it. And I'm just the downloader. That's all, the messenger. But I had no understanding of it growing up. And, being empathic and feeling other things, it made it very difficult at times because, I was a spiritual person way before spirituality was accepted. It was religion, not paganism, not spirituality. And I had no compass to kind of compare like other spiritual people around me. I had no compass or people to kind of turn to or talk to about it. People would congregate towards me, always, even as a child, to discuss these things in in whatever way, but there was still my navigation of it has been very organic through the years. And it's really only in the last 2 or 3 years that I have felt less lonely. A, because I get to meet such beautiful spiritual people doing these podcasts, but also finally, I don't need to be heard or seen. You either do or you don't. And I don't need to be invested if you do anymore. I put it out. If it's received, it's received. If it isn't, it isn't. But those first 10 years I had really ups and downs. And my father's illness, my illness, my brother's at boarding school, my sister's at boarding school. I'm home alone a lot until I go to boarding school. And, some good memories. Like I had some happy times at boarding school. Oh, yes, talking about food at boarding school. In British um, old stories like Dickens, things like this, there would be characters in there. And the two characters here were our kitchen staff. Elsie Tanner, tall and skinny, and Mrs. Hawkins, who was round like a butterball. And they, were our chefs. And for the most part, we absolutely loved our food. And then one day they decided to dish out this stuff like slop. Nobody would eat it. And we had day children. And so the day children would tell their parents to phone our parents because it was a private boarding school. They were being paid a lot and nobody was going to eat that. I do remember another time was somebody trying to throw her tomato over to another kid at another table because she didn't want it. And she put it on the edge of the fork and she was meant to flick it so the tomato went over. But she let go of the fork and it ended up in the girl's hand. So between tomato and blood, it was streaming down her arm. Another time, a kid was crocheting and her hook got caught in her leg. But the school actually had to close. And so I went back to, day school back home. It had to close because the principal, the gentleman, developed cancer and they had to close it. But it had beautiful marshlands around it and forests. And the one thing I learned quite significant, we would go on these walks on Saturdays and Sundays. And it's always like, oh, we're going to go for this walk. We're going to go over there. It's so far. We have this wonderful teacher saying, no, we're going to walk to that pole over there. Oh, let's go look at this tree. Oh, let's go look at this. And the next thing you know, you've done the whole circuit without feeling overwhelmed and burdened by it. It was always paying attention to the next step. And then the next step and the next step, which is a really good lesson in life, instead of looking at the entire journey and feeling intimidated by it. And there was one time we had a wonderful golden retriever and her son, Ruff he was called. And the mama went missing. And some girls we'd all gone out for a walk into the forest and come home and it's dinner time. And they realized that a couple of girls were missing. And there's big panic, police out, search people out. And the Ruff's mama had gone missing too. And so what had happened, and this was at a time where there was a serial killer of children, nowhere near where we were, but in England. So of course it was really big for children to go missing. Nowadays, unfortunately, way too common, and we don't look at it as such urgency as we should. And anyway, they eventually found the kids, and the kids had gone looking for the mama dog to bring her home. But the mama dog had gone away to die. And so it was quite traumatic because, the girls came home and we were reprimanded that we're not allowed to leave out on our own, etc. But there were some happy moments there. And as I said, kind of this happened more at 11, but I'll bring it in now. The headmistress one day kept me out of prayers in the morning because we always have prayers in the morning before going to class. And she told everybody in there that indeed my father was dead. Stop teasing me about it. Stop teasing me about my illness, be nice. And it changed a little bit, but kids are going to be kids, right? Most kids would go home at weekends. I didn't. We only lived an hour and a half away, or even an hour away. And yet I didn't go home at weekends. I went home at half term and end of term. And so sometimes I'd be the only person there at the weekend. So yeah, loneliness again, right? But some good memories as well as some not good memories. But isn't that life? So by the time I was 11, I'd gone to three schools. Um, but up until the age of 10, hit with the illness, discovering I could talk to people. And of course, I didn't register that they were dead entities. There were people from another dimension. It just, they were just people I was talking to. So it never registered. I would play with my dolls and, they would come alive. Um, I played a lot with my dolls on my own because I was on my own a lot. I had a friend who was around my age, a little bit younger, Marie-Therese de Zuleleta. And I called her Poo Poo for short. I don't know why. Her father was working for the royal family. I can't remember exact what, but very prestigious people. And we had fun together. And then there was Jane Amanda. She was definitely younger than me. And she was my mum's, at the time, best friend's daughter. And we would hang out together. But there wasn't kind of these play groups that you went to. There wasn't, let's have afternoon tea and get the kids together. It was very rare. You had parties from kids at school, but it just wasn't the same type of gathering that we do for our children today. So there was a lot of alone time. But I would also go and take my pram out into the street, go a few blocks walking my pram because I always wanted to be a mama. That mamahood was always screaming at me. And in those days, it wasn't so scary. As long as we were back by dinner, everybody knew we were safe. And so, yeah. And we had wonderful fairs in the park where there'd be this fair and that fair and be food goodies and entertainment. And that park is still there today. It has a lake and it has a wonderful coffee bar. My brother, who's moved back to that area, walks there every day for a coffee and a pastry and read his paper and then walk back. And it's a nice walk and it's a nice park, but we lived right across the road from it. So between our beach home and that house and then moving um, to the bungalow, which wasn't our last house, I will bring that up in the next decade. And and yeah, it's I didn't, kind of have so much interaction with my brother at that time. He would come home, he was 5 years older than me. We did a bit of chasing each other, on the beach, but they would be home for whatever time period and then off again. My sister, being 13 years older than me, as I grew, she, you know, was out there as an adult. So she and I only really kind of started connecting in my teens, which will be the next decade. So, yeah, memories. It's funny, isn't it? Kind of looking at 7 decades and then trying to go back to each decade and look at it and try and remember things. And I think that's the important thing is that we need to write it down, speak it down, do whatever to try and remember because things do blend together, even in telling you stories together. Was that 11, 12? Was that 9, 10? And it's trying to remember. But they all have huge influences. Obviously my illness has had huge influence all my life. And then, of course, 30 years ago, I was given fibromyalgia. So, I've dealt with illness my entire life. But it's always been about focusing on what I can do, being sad about what I can't, but focusing on what I can do and being adventurous. And I think that's something that I don't know, I think would have been in my dad had the war not happened. Who knows? His adventurism came out of racing cars and boats, flying planes. My adventurism has come out in travel. So, yes, it was a rocky road, had its highs, had its lows. The dog Candy was a blessed soul that when I did leave boarding school and went back home, that was my best friend. But that, as I said, it's the next decade. So up to the age of 10, boarding school, The first school, St. Martin's, three schools in the first 10 years. Because I went to school in Healing at the bungalow, which was a small school, and it was for elementary kids. And I remember kind of being introduced to what the Olympics was. And of course, we would have a school break where they bring out milk. Unfortunately, I couldn't drink milk, but milk and cookies. And then we would have lunch. And I do remember one time doing a handstand, not a handstand, a backward crab thing, and landing on a bee, which wasn't very much fun. But yes, it was kind of, I was at that age of becoming more interested in things and seeing things in a different way. And I remember that's when I learned to ride my two-wheeler bike and rode it up and down the street. And at the end of the street was a huge big field that we used to take the dogs up. I'll finish with this story. My dad and I would take Candy, the dog, up there. And there was this big, huge bulldog, woof, woof, woof. And the owner was kind of bullish as well. And the bulldog would chase after other dogs. And we would ask him to train it not to do so. And one day, I decided to pick on Candy. And Candy wasn't going to be picked on. Border Collie, you had a herd, and she herded that bulldog going yup, 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 all the way back to his owner. That changed everything. Now it is an entire subdivision of houses that's been there for a long, long time, because don't forget, we were there in the 60s. And we did move to another house, but that is in the next decade, the last house my dad was in. But I enjoyed those walks with Dad. It was fun. Life was funny. Oh yeah, one more story. There was a TV show called 77 Sunset Strip. In one of the shows, they were dealing with a murder of somebody that had been put in an electric chair at a museum. And the person had pressed down the electric. It was meant to be a dummy, and they realized it was somebody. I snuck in to watch that through the crack of the door. And it freaked me out. I must have been about 8 or 9. And then the next day, I wouldn't sit on any chair. Come and sit down. It's dinner. Then I wouldn't sit on any chair. I cried and cried. They let me sit somewhere else and eat my dinner. And eventually they got it out of me. I'd snuck up and watched the show, and I didn't want to be electrocuted. So I wouldn't sit on any chair. They said, that's what you get for sneaking in and trying to watch something way beyond your years. But yeah, I did a lot of that sneaking to watch TV through the cracks. Because I didn't sleep very well. So I wanted to, watch something. Later would find out that was ADD, but that was another thing, another decade. But yeah, there's some funny moments there. So decade 2 to come next week. And it's quite interesting revisiting. The next decade is a lot more tumultuous. But this decade set the stage, didn't it? So until next time, folks, bye for now. We hope that you enjoyed the show. There are so many more for you to listen to right here on selfdiscoverywisdom.com. Come and hear the illumination that's going to shed light on your path.
Find your path with the knowledge of others and become